I think I've figured out Toto's Grand Mercedes master plan, and that is to get Mick Schumacher back into Formula 1 just like he did with Ocon. Now I think the biggest question that most people may have is whether Mick Schumacher is worthy of being in Formula 1 or not. Short answer is yes. Now before you type in the comments, which I know you will do, and I actually do reply to every single one of them, Mick Schumacher's a really bad Formula 1 driver and that he doesn't deserve to be in the sport and that he'll just crash more cars. Well, drivers crash cars. You know the recent stink about Charles Lecrash, Crash de Maldonado, Cristiano de Crasher? I mean, I could even throw you some Mick jokes of like in Wreck Schumacher or Mick Shoe Crasher, but that's besides the point right now. It's quite clear at this point that Toto Wolff likes to see drivers get their dues, and if he feels like a Formula 1 driver, especially one under his management, is actually not really getting the chance that they deserve to be in the sport, he'll actually take them under his wing, develop them, and then put them back in, and they do actually go on to do greater things. Like I said with Esteban Ocon. After he got dropped by Racing Point / Force India, he was taken into the Mercedes fold and actually developed through 2019, and then back in 2020, he went to Renault and now Alpine, and he's actually really cemented his spot in Formula 1 as a very solid driver who does actually pull some surprises every now and again, but is also not really popular whilst on the track and makes very daring moves. You know, back in Spain with Alonso, that really reminded me of Schumacher and Barrichello in 2010. Then you got good old Stoffel Vandoorne. After being dropped by McLaren, he then got taken under the Mercedes wing, and wouldn't you know it, he's actually excelled in Formula E. So Toto actually does have an eye for talent, and him bringing in Mick Schumacher, who's now doing the Pirelli tyre test tomorrow, is actually starting to really flex what he can actually do when he's in a car that can actually, you know, get podiums and consistently score points. You see, by going to Mercedes, he's actually getting the Formula 1 training that he didn't really have at Haas, and not really the assurance and guidance as a rookie, except from his race engineer Gary Gannon, who I will actually categorically say is one of the nicest race engineers I've ever heard. So what is Toto's master plan with Mick? Well, I think it's quite obvious. He's now trying to flog Mick Schumacher to any team that will take him. The first part was to sign Mick Schumacher as a reserve driver for Mercedes, bringing a Schumacher back into Mercedes for the first time since 2012 when his father Michael was driving for Mercedes, and I think it's safe to say that Michael Schumacher's work in those first 3 seasons really paved the way for Lewis Hamilton to prosper in those following years. A 7-time world champion laid down all of the groundwork for the next 7-time world champion to prosper. Now the next step is to really bring Mick Schumacher into the fold and work together with Lewis and George, having them singing his praises during the Spanish Grand Prix, when both Lewis and George went on record saying that Mick Schumacher's work in the simulator on Friday and Saturday really helped them gain a double podium finish, their first one this season, saying that he was up until 2 AM making sure that the setups were good to go after a really tricky Friday practice session, really saving the day for both of them. A 7-time world champion praising you and really giving you an actual boost in showing how hardworking you are and how much you can contribute to the team is something you cannot ignore. If you get Hamilton saying that you're good, that means you're good. And even George, who was clearly the future of Mercedes, praising about Mick Schumacher's dedication when he is a dedicated and solid individual himself, is something that you cannot ignore either. Now, of course, I know that when it comes to the simulator, it's not just one driver who is working on it. There are plenty of other simulation drivers as well as the staff who are there to operate the simulator and then pass through all the data that the drivers, including Mick Schumacher, actually produced. But the point is, though, is that Mick Schumacher is actually being put on a pedestal, being praised by George and Lewis, and therefore showing to everyone, all of the teams, and proving Haas wrong that Mick Schumacher is definitely someone that you want on your team if you want to develop, because they managed to save Mercedes bacon when they genuinely thought they might not have that good a weekend. If you can do well at Barcelona, you can pretty much do well at any track throughout the rest of the season, so there is really high hopes for Mercedes securing 2nd place in the Constructors now. Now if you're just thinking, oh well that's all well and good, but Mick won't get back in, he had his chance and he blew it. Well, I will remind you about what happened with Felipe Massa in 2003. He got dropped by Sauber in 2002, admittedly at a time when he and Takuma Sato came into the sport and they were both sort of mavericks. Massa sat on the sidelines and became a development driver for Ferrari during that year, especially because of that connection with Sauber at the time. He came back into Sauber in 2004 after having a year at Maranello under the tutelage of Michael Schumacher and Rubens Barrichello, and he was a changed person, ultimately coming back to Ferrari in 2006, staying with them until 2013, and having that first season with Michael Schumacher really being a stepping stone towards him challenging for the title in 2008. That just goes to show, if you have a year out, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're done. I mean, take a look at Nico Hülkenberg. He went out in 2019, he came back every now and again, but now he's back on the grid, and he's really pulling that Haas up into places where it shouldn't be. He's actually scored the most points for Haas, and he does give the car some moments in qualifying, even though it doesn't really go anywhere afterwards. But the point is that sometimes a driver needs a break before returning, and that's what Daniel Ricciardo was banking on. Having 1 year out and then coming back in again, all revitalized, refreshed, refocused. Yeah, that's what Mick is hoping for. Toto wants Mick back on the grid, and I think Formula 1 wants Mick back on the grid. He just needs a year in a team that can actually hone his skills and give him all the tools and the tricks of the trade in which to actually utilize, because everyone thinks that, oh, he had 2 seasons at Haas and he really didn't amount to anything, completely unlike what he had in Formula 3 and Formula 2. Remember 2021, that Haas car, the VF21, was pretty much nothing. They didn't develop it at all, and you put 2 rookies in there in a car which was underdeveloped, in fact not developed at all, and was very much known for being really tricky to drive. And I think even a veteran, if you put Magnussen in that car, I'm pretty sure he would have had a tough time as well, and also complaining about the car, because he was complaining about the car in 2020 and 2019 and summer 2018. So, you know, a tricky Haas car is not exactly new. So 2021 was sort of a holding pattern and just Mick getting to know what the Formula 1 circus was all about. 2022, on the other hand, was something that he can actually call his first proper season. And yes, of course, he did crash. You can't deny that. He did have some moments. But now it's got to the point where, yeah, okay, rookies crash. They crash a lot. I mean, Mazepin crashed and other rookies crashed. Logan Sargent has crashed, but you don't hear nearly as much complaints, and Gunther Steiner complaining about it to this day, and pretty much making it one of his biggest memes and tropes right now, is to the point of obsession, and he really should just really stop talking about it, and it's getting to the point where actually the media is sort of telling Gunther to just calm down, mate. And I think Toto is banking on that to be the person to actually go to Gunther and say, no, Mick Schumacher is a good driver. Let me prove it. George, Lewis, help me out here. Mick is a good guy, and when he is in his element and he knows that he can fight for points and maybe podiums, he just fires up and you get to see elements of his father. Remember Austria and elements of Silverstone when he did score points. He was fired up. When he felt like they were holding him back and giving Magnussen more praise, he was furious, and the expression on his face was just so captivating. It just really makes you think that if he had a car where he could genuinely fight and he was challenging people and he was getting into the spirit, he could be absolute media gold. I mean, not to mention his name and heritage, that goes without saying, but he's a really nice guy. He's really good, he's hardworking, dedicated, he doesn't rub up people the wrong way, and I've got to say, the way that Haas treated him towards the second half of the season and not really allowing him to actually enjoy the car just for the sake of giving Hülkenberg a functional car, that was just sad. That was just really, really sad. He definitely deserves a second chance, much like with Esteban Ocon, who we all thought got short shrift, and then of course Stoffel Vandoorne, who's now gone on to do well in Formula E, and is technically the reserve driver for Aston Martin, and everyone wants to see Vandoorne back, even though he didn't really set the world alight in his 2 seasons. But the question is though, where can Mick go? Who is actually going to look at what Toto is advertising and say, yes, we're going to take Mick Schumacher, and then put pen to paper? Well, I think he actually does have a chance to drive for Williams in 2024 or 2025. And if things go really south at McLaren, he is technically a reserve driver for McLaren if Norris decides to jump ship and go to Mercedes, or goes to another team, or maybe even partner Red Bull. Everyone wants him to partner up with Max, but I don't think 2 friends should be actually driving for the same team because they'll start to not like each other. Rosberg, Hamilton. But I think if Mick Schumacher did go to Williams, if Alex Albon got the call back to Red Bull to either drive for AlphaTauri or to partner Max Verstappen, he could actually be a really good leading driver on the ground floor where Williams are starting to rebuild themselves properly this time under the supervision of James Vowles, who actually worked for Mercedes for years. Or maybe he might replace Logan Sargent if he's not actually pulling his weight and James has to cut him off at the end of the season or something like that. Albon and Schumacher together, that could be a very solid lineup in a time when Williams can actually start to develop their car properly. And that would be part also of Toto's grand master plan, because he is a shareholder of Williams, so I think he would also like to see Williams do really well for the sake of, you know, getting more money. and also seeing his driver on the grid too. Schumacher's just the next Esteban Ocon, and Ocon worked out just fine. So I just think he definitely deserves a chance, folks. You watch this space, Schumacher to Williams.